My name's Jesper Hornberg. I'm the CEO of Global Resilience Partnership, and it's lovely to have you here and also those that are watching online. Um, we're here to talk about the resilience science must knows. How do you navigate uncertainty? And this has been a pet child of many of us for a long time. I'm going to do this in a very pedagogic way because we're all quite warm. Um, we're all watching, sitting in, doing panels. We're a bit tired, so I'm just going to break it down by making statements, and then I'm going to pose a couple of questions. Yeah. So resilience is everywhere. It's embedded in public health, business strategy, development, finance policy, and so on. So we know that it is, but why is it so difficult to make it more actionable? Well, the challenge is that there are many definitions. Despite rich research, resilience science remains hard to translate into action. So here's what we're trying to do. So there's a need. Decision makers urgently need stuff to work with that they can grasp. So it needs to be translated in a good way. They need clear, science-based insights to support people, planet, and their work. This need is not only logical, and it's not something that we just came up with. It's been a pet child for a while, but it's an actual ask from many decision makers. How do I bring this into my processes? So what's the response? You see how pedagogic I am? I mean, I'm just like taking you through the motions here. Well, the response is the resilience science must knows, which we're talking about today. So these are 9 key insights distilled from decades of research. They've been refined through convenings, talking with decision makers from all different sectors. Now, you might wonder, who is it for? Well, it's for leaders and decision makers at all levels, from all sectors, from communities, governments, businesses, donors, international institutions. I have to admit, I sometimes use the thinking in my daily life as well. It makes sense to have a bit of redundancy at the right time. And I don't mean to simplify things, because we're going to listen to some really smart people in a minute. Now it's time to listen to 2 different perspectives. I would like to invite Ricarda Winkelmann, professor at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact and Research, and also Max Planck Institute for Geoanthropology. Could I ask you to come up here and tell us your perspectives? And you can sit if you want, or you can stand if you want. Totally up to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a great honor and a pleasure to be part of this launch of this very important report. So this is an incredibly important moment, because for the first time, researchers across different disciplines have come together to assess the resilience science must-knows. So here we have them. This is essentially what every negotiator should know about resilience. This is so important and also so timely. Why? Well, from a climate and Earth system scientist's perspective, let me share 3 observations. Number 1 is we're now deep into the Anthropocene, where humans have become a geological force, and turbulence is actually the new norm. We are actually in uncharted territory. So I just want to give you a few numbers on this. Science shows that CO2 concentrations are at its highest in at least 2 million years. Sea level rise is faster than in at least 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice is at its lowest in at least 2,000 years. And glaciers are retreating at an unprecedented rate. So with all of these observations, it's clear that we are in uncharted territory, and that we continue to move actually in the wrong direction when it comes to emissions, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and ultimately the global mean temperature. And if we continue on this trajectory, we'll actually see a warming that's equivalent to the difference between an ice age and a warm age, but on much, much faster timescales. And that brings me to my second observation, and that is that the impacts are already here. So if we just think back to the last year. 2024 has been the warmest year on record, with more than 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial levels. And for instance, here in Brazil alone, 2023, 2024 saw, on the one hand side, an unprecedented drought, which is considered the worst in at least 70 years, driven by the combined effects of climate change, El Nino, and also deforestation. But at the same time, in this short time frame, Brazil has also seen a record-breaking flood that affected over 2 million people and claimed more than 180 lives. So these are just snapshots in time and examples that show us that the impacts are increasing, and that this is despite the fact that the Earth system actually holds a lot of resilience, because the Earth system, as our planetary life support system, is currently still buffering a lot of the effects that we would otherwise see. Because if it weren't for the ocean and the vegetation taking up carbon, for instance, we would already see a much more drastic warming globally. So in other words, it's the resilience of the Earth system that has saved us from the most severe impacts so far. And that brings me to my third observation. Because we are seeing worrying signs of the Earth resilience weakening. Think, for instance, of the albedo, which is reducing, which means that there's less of the radiation reflected back, and that means higher warming rates. Think about the reduced capacity of the ocean and the vegetation to take up carbon. Climate change has already reduced this capacity of the ocean and the land carbon sinks compared to what they might have been, where the land sink has seen about a 20% reduction and the ocean about 7%. And with that, we also see that the rate of warming is accelerating. We know that an overshoot of the 1.5 degree mark is actually inevitable by now, and likely to occur already in the next 5 to 10 years. And with that, we're also seeing increasing risks of triggering tipping dynamics in the Earth system. And this goes for many of the important parts of the Earth system, from the Amazon rainforest to the polar ice sheets. And here is where resilience also touches upon some of the nonlinear effects that we have in the Earth system, because that is essentially what tipping dynamics imply. They imply abrupt changes and irreversible changes over human timescales. So just to give one example, if we trigger tipping dynamics in one of the ice sheets in Greenland or Antarctica, then that will inevitably lead to multi-meter sea level rise over really long timescales. And this also means that it's actually our decisions and our actions now that will decide what the face of our planet, our coastlines, will look like in centuries, if not millennia. So it is incredibly important to know how resilience is changing and what resilience actually means in the human Earth system, especially now in the Anthropocene, as we have entered this uncharted territory. And so let me close by saying that resilience is not just a buzzword. We're hearing it a lot here, especially at COP30. But it's actually an operating manual for our survival on planet Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricarda. Great. I mean, what I'm hearing is that we don't have many options but to actually address this and work with this. I'd now like to invite my second perspective on stage. So Fatima Denton, Director at the UN University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa. I'm curious, what's your take on this?
Always have to adjust mics. Okay. So thank you very much. And this is one initiative that, you know, as I'm reading through the one pager. Thank you very much. Yes, there's so much to agree with, and just to thank Albert, Sibel, and Wendy, and everybody who worked on this, because I think we can mine it for a long while, and we'll still find things that are relevant. Ricardo's observation made me think about the word turbulence. Can you hear me? Yeah, so I was just wondering, why do we often associate resilience with turbulence? Is it possible that we can just think about resilience as an everyday practice, as something we do because we have to? So why turbulence? And it's dawned on me that it could be both a threat and a teacher. I see this as interesting and important because in one way, when we have threat, it forces us to be more than, just passive, adapting, which is very often the restricted sort of meaning about resilience, that people just cope, as if they have this bandwidth, they will just carry on coping and coping and coping and coping. So I think the threat that we have turbulence, that things are going to get uncertain and difficult, pushes us to go beyond the passive towards being actively resilient. So in a way, closer, in a way, what this means is that if we use it well, then turbulence is not the enemy. Turbulence becomes almost like the raw material that we feed on, that enables us to be more active. And for me, the activeness of being resilient is so important because that leads us to that co-evolution. We are co-evolving. And yesterday I said somewhere that I don't see resilience as an end goal. It's a process. It's not a destination. And I think the co-evolution, we talk about it in this point number 4, which is about the learning and innovation. When I think about resilience and the 3 parts of what resilience mean, the adaptation aspect, the absorption of risk. But the 3rd part for me is where the actual gold mine is. The 3rd part is the part where you get to innovate, the part where you get to self-learn, the reflexive learning, the part that allows you to self-organize. So I think in many different parts of Africa, which is a lot of my research is really looking at Africa, the beauty about resilience is that the communities co-evolve together. They learn about different ways of doing things. They decide to take a different strategy. They pivot towards a different strategy because they themselves realize that resilience is a strength. So that strength enables them to adopt different ways of doing things. Very long time ago, I remember I was in Senegal, and I was talking to a group of women farmers, and they basically said they had to go into the process of organization because the young people were leaving. I come from the Gambia, and they found a way of describing migration as the back door. So in Senegal, it's a big problem. So when they realized the young people were leaving, they decided to have a meeting and discuss what were the strategies. Because the young people leaving means that you have land that is not being managed, that's not tilled, and therefore agriculture is basically not producing much. So this meeting that they had allowed them to say, okay, what else can we do? So they thought about other ways of diversifying, not just staying on agriculture, but they went into livestock rearing, and they thought about other products that they could get from livestock that they could sell. So that conversation enabled them to become more resilient because they realized that the departure of young people was a capital that they were losing. And so the self-organization and the decision to go into other ways of thinking outside just agriculture allowed them to be more resilient. And within months, they could see the benefit of some of the other things that they were doing: horticulture, livestock, forestry. So there were other ways of diversifying their incomes. And that's because they met, they coalesced, they thought about it, they reimagined their strategies. And that was something that was very helpful. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is oftentimes when we think about resilience, we think about resilience as if it was power neutral, and it isn't. So the reason why it's not power neutral is when communities, and I talk about resilience very often, but I say communities, but it's not just communities that have to be resilient. Institutions have to be resilient. But oftentimes, again, if I focus on just communities, when we expect communities after a flood or after an extreme event to be resilient, we don't question what are some of the power structures that have landed them into that resilient space. We just expect them to sort of go through the motions of what they can do. So that recovery process, that buffer potential. But it's also equally important to think about the power dynamics, because the power dynamics then decides who can be resilient and who cannot. And what are those parameters? What are some of the benefits? How come some people have got the mechanisms and the tools to be resilient and others don't? So I think power is very much associated with creating the conditions that either enable resilience or constrain resilience. So we need to really think about that in terms of what are the power dynamics. The second part is how do we think about resilience, but think more in terms of both justice and governance. I say this because if we don't embed justice within our resilient framework, we have a very fragile framework. So part of understanding how we can be better resilient is ensuring that there is justice. Recently, we invited a very well-known person, I wouldn't mention her name, who was talking about the importance of critical minerals in Africa. And she basically dismantled the whole concept of what critical mineral is. And he said, well, the African continent is boasting about having 30% of the critical minerals. And this narrative that we have 30% doesn't mean anything because the continent doesn't have control of the resources that it has. So talking about being home to 30% of the minerals or hosting 30% of the minerals and knowing that the supply chain doesn't stay in Africa. The supply chain is being controlled by others. And you just have to look at all the different players, from China to the EU, to all the expectations of what critical minerals would mean. And that's where governance means something. That's where we need to really use the governance lever to be able to say, resilience helps us to ensure that we're working within these planetary boundaries. It helps us ensure that we are looking at the political economy and the political ecology. Because even as we talk about mining, it has a cost. It has a cost not just from an economic perspective, a technological perspective, but from an ecological perspective. Very often when we mine, we degrade our biosphere. And the conditions that we leave behind are very often worse. So I often say that responsible mining for me is an oxymoron. I don't know how you do it. So I think in that same breath, as we're talking about resilience, bear in mind that there's a power dynamics. We also have to now switch to thinking about how do we get resilience right? And how we get it right is by pulling on that governance lever. Because governance allows us, as I said this morning, to equalize things, to stabilize things. Power takes away that equalizing factor. Power constrains that factor, but governance, especially good governance, which is intuitively what I'm thinking about, enables us to see how can we better leverage on power, but how can we use it as that thread that binds us together, that helps us to work in that circle of learning, that circle of innovation, and the circle of co-creation. So those are my three thoughts, to copy Ricardo. 3, the magic number. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima and Ricardo. I could just sit there all day, and it is pretty hot, so that's a good grade from me. We're going to listen to two very important people to this whole project. There's a whole bunch of people behind it, but they will tell us about that. And they will tell us more about the actual 9 no's. So please, if I can ask my dear friends Sibel and Albert to come on stage.
Is this one on? Testing, that's good. Okay, so this report really came out of an increased observation of a huge appetite and use of the term resilience, both in the private sector, the international decision-making sphere, the EU, the financial sector. All of these different places of society are increasingly using resilience in their reports and in the decision-making contexts. We saw an inflection point actually following the COVID-19 pandemic, where a lot of the recovery programs of big institutions like the IMF, the EU, the UN actually had resilience smack bang in the middle of investment programs, recovery programs, and so on. The issue, however, was we were also hearing an increased demand by these actors for science to distill the complex science of resilience into a distilled product that summarizes what are the key insights, the key must-knows of resilience. And we rose to that challenge. We've been working over a year together with Sibel and other colleagues who are in this room to generate this report, which in a nutshell distills decades, 40, 50 years of resilient science into this clear, accessible must-knows, guidance sets for policy, practice, and investment. And we really hope that people in this room and outside can really see it and use it as a trusted foundation for the use of resilience in their respective sectors and fields and decision-making contexts.
Yeah, and wow, this was... I'm very excited that we're finally launching this. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about the process in itself and how we did it. And how we did it was really sort of like the result, like the resilient science must-knows were developed to an extremely collaborative process at the global level. So first, we wanted to do a broad scanning of resilient science. So we asked hundreds of resilience experts around the world through a survey. We asked them this question: if you would have 4 minutes in an elevator with a decision maker, what would be the one thing from your work in resilience that you would tell him? And we got responses from, full responses, from sort of like more than 120 experts that resulted in 150 resilience must-knows. And now what we do with it? And then we counted, so we gathered together like 20 leading resilience scholars to form an editorial board to sort of help us to combine that information, to compile it, to distill it into what would be the final must-knows. Then we also sort of like complemented that with a target literature review across several fields of resilience. I want to stress that, so sort of like both the editorial board and the literature review and the experts that we sent the survey out, they are sort of experts around several fields of resilience. So climate resilience is one of them, but also food systems resilience, equitable resilience, so like a whole range of fields. And then from this process, we got into sort of like a first short list of resilient science must-knows. But we don't want it, we never wanted this to be a process that was just prescriptive, like the science says, you know? So we wanted this actually to be relevant to our target audience. So we took this first list of resilient science must-knows, and we took it to sort of a series of consultation workshops. We did 4 consultation workshops that have engaged sort of like 162 decision makers from more than 130 organizations. And these workshops were also like regional workshops, so done in different regions of the world, with representatives from like civil society, communities, from business leaders, from multilateral organizations. So there was a diversity of people engaged. And what we asked them was like, is this list, are these must-knows relevant for you? And if they are not, tell us how we can make it relevant. And so we adapted the language, and we prioritized also based on that feedback. And that's how we came to the list of 9 resilience must-knows. And now I'm going to ask Albert to actually tell us what are they.
Okay, this is how we're going to do it. We're not going to go through the full detail of every single 9 must-know, because then we'd be here for a very long time. You have the report, you have the 2 pages here, you can download it and look at things in detail. What we'll do now is a bit of a myth busting. So for every must-know, we'll be busting a few myths, hopefully getting you to think a bit about it, and then hopefully engaging with us in a discussion afterwards. So the first resilience science must-know is resilience is critical for navigating accelerating risk. And the myth we're busting in this one is that resilience is something we can choose to have or build. It's optional. It's something that's nice to have for future challenges. What we show in this report and what evidence is showing is that resilience is actually completely non-negotiable in the era that we're living in today, deep in the Anthropocene, as Ricardo mentioned. With all these accelerating crises and cascading risks, the only way we can safeguard the future of people, nature, economies, is to invest in resilience. The point we also make in this must-know is that sometimes resilience can be undesirable. There's some things that we want to break, some systems we want to leave in order for having a just and sustainable future.
And resilience must-know number 2, it's about that resilience requires balancing the capacities to cope, to adapt, and to transform. So the most important thing here is that resilience is not just about bouncing back from a shock or a crisis. But true resilience means that we actually need to acknowledge that conditions are constantly changing, right? And that means that we need the capacity to immediately cope with a sudden shock or a crisis, but we also need to adjust and to adapt to constantly changing conditions. And whenever we see that sort of solutions and the way how we are doing things is no longer fit, we actually need to fundamentally transform. So it is this triple capacity that is the foundation of resilience. The important thing also to say here is that it's not that these capacities are sequential, like one after the other and after the other. No, they need to be fostered, all 3 simultaneously. So sort of when a crisis hits, you basically see which parts of the system you need to preserve, which parts need to adapt, which parts need to transform. I can give you just a simple example. So sort of if we think of the resilience of the Earth system, okay, or the resilience of the Amazon, it's nothing that we want to transform. It's something that we want to preserve. But in order to preserve that, societies will need to adapt, and they will need to fundamentally transform, for instance, away from fossil fuel-based economies, right? So that's the idea. So sort of it's really, the key word is really the balancing these 3 capacities.
The third must-know is investing in resilience today reduces costs tomorrow. And the myth we're busting here is that resilience investment is just a costly luxury, again, something we can do in the future. What increasing evidence is showing is that investing in resilience today has huge benefits. It's a smart, cost-saving strategy. It makes us avoid both human and infrastructure losses. It unlocks growth by minimizing risk and generating a level playing field where you can invest and generate innovation. It also strengthens societies, nature, and economies. So the key thing here is that the return in investing in resilience far exceeds the upfront costs. A key point we make here, however, is that we need completely different economic frameworks that capture these multiple values in order to make resilience investments even more profoundly visible. So we need valuation systems that capture economic costs, but also social and natural capital costs.
So resilience must know number 4. It's about, says that resilience is a cycle of learning and innovation. And this is quite a bit what Fatima talked about, and thank you for touching that. The main thing here is this idea that resilience is some kind of fixed state that can just be something that can be fixed with one-off type of interventions. We all like goals. We have the 1.5 goal. We have adaptation goals. Those are extremely important. But the trap is when we think of resilience of something static. Resilience is not something static. It's a process, a dynamic process that needs to be fostered and developed on a daily basis. And the key idea here, so it is that sort of, in order to keep resilient, to keep being resilient, you need to experiment, you need to assess, you need to monitor, you need to reassess, you learn with it, and then you also innovate. So you have to have this constant dynamic cycle of learning and innovation. Why innovation and why is it important? Because it brings the sources that for adaptation and for transformation. Because that requires novelty, new ways of doing, new ways of thinking. And a final important thing here is that when we talk about innovation, we're not just talking about, new scientific knowledge or new technologies or sort of. Innovating is about weaving the old and the new. So sort of like, traditional knowledge, weaving it with sort of like other sources of knowledge. Number 5 says that diversity is essential for resilience to thrive. And the myth here is that diversity is a nice thing, that's good on paper, but that's actually not essential. But diversity is actually the cornerstone of resilience. If I would choose one thing, I would probably choose that. Why? 2 main reasons. First, diversity provides diversity of options. So sort of like you keep an option space that sort of allows you to cope, to adapt, to transform when crisis hits. The second reason is that diversity is a source of novelty and innovation. Okay, so innovation that is needed for adaptive strategies, for transformative strategies, they sort of are grounded on diversity. So you need to actively foster diversity. And when we talk about fostering diversity, it's not just biodiversity, so it's all kinds of diversity. It's diversity of capitals, it's cognitive diversity, it's diversity of cultures, of knowledge. So fostering this actively in whatever system you're doing, if it's a business, if it's a community, if it's an institution, it's keeping your options open, keeping your sources of innovation.
So the 6th must know is relationships among people and with nature build resilience. So we've seen it in a lot of my research as well, looking at how different big organizations, decision-making bodies define resilience. There's often a thought and a bit of a myth that resilience is built by just investing in infrastructure and technical systems. These things are important, but crucially, we also know that resilience is really ultimately rooted in relationships between people, within communities, between people and nature, and also relationships within nature, connectivity within nature. Altogether, these connections enable things like trust and learning, coordination, and care to evolve. It is me. Resilience science must know number 7 is all governing and negotiating trade-offs being key to resilience. So another myth we're dispelling here is that when you're investing in resilience, when you're trying to operationalize resilience, you always get these beautiful win-win situations and you get straightforward results. There's an increasing body of research really showing that resilience investment, resilience decisions also lead to trade-offs. And you really need to negotiate these trade-offs. These trade-offs can occur across space. An action you do somewhere in the world leads to a result somewhere else in the world, in this increasingly connected world. You have trade-offs across time. An investment, a decision you make today will have future impacts far down the line. So this is really about generating governance systems that can balance these competing interests, these values, and these different time frames. So decentralized governance systems, polycentric and adaptive governance systems. And an important point we make here is that while having strong leaders and central actors in these governance systems is key, they can't overwhelm the capacity for coordination and multi-level collaboration in essence.
So number 8, it's about agency. So empowering agency unlocks resilience. And the myth here is that resilience is something that we can externally impose. We can't. So resilience is something that is endogenous of individuals, of communities, of institutions. But it is key also, like in this, having agency means really to have the power and the resources to act intentionally, both individually and collectively. The key thing here is that because sort of like resilience is endogenous, it doesn't mean that sort of like that we should not support agency, right? So it means that, you know, anyone that is sort of like disempowered or that is sort of like the access to decision making is denied cannot make full exercise of their agency. And so it's our responsibility to create sort of like more inclusive decision making, or truly inclusive, I would say, decision making processes that actually allow that endogenous agency to be sort of like expressed. And finally, last but definitely not least, address power imbalances to foster equitable resilience. So Fatima, you touched so beautifully around this, I think. And it was striking how this was sort of like present, you know, in the responses from the scientists, in the resilience-related literature. This idea so the myth is really that sort of like whenever you do a resilience intervention, you're assuming that everyone will benefit equally, or that sort of like everyone has, you know, as by default, sort of the same resilience capacities or the same sort of like opportunity to develop their resilience capacities. So that's not true. So actually, like historical legacies like colonialism that you talked about, you know, like that have sort of like deep social inequalities really shape who can access resources, who can take part of decision-making processes, and who can actually, you know, build their own resilience to cope, to adapt, to transform. So this is crucial. And yeah, Albert, I'm just wondering, as we went through the 9, if you just wanted to give like some key messages to decision makers in the room and at COP30 about the 9 resilience must knows, which messages would you choose?
It's not a surprise because they're up there, right? No, but seriously, I mean, I could sit down and have a long conversation with decision makers about what this report would mean for them. But if we try and summarize it very quickly, it would actually be these 5 bullet points. It would be act now. Don't wait with resilience investments far into the future. We're in a period of time where we're seeing so much turbulence, so much uncertainty that resilience investments has to happen now and not when the next crisis hits us. That actually means doing a bunch of things that might feel uncomfortable. Transformations, shifting from efficiency to flexibility, learning, and ultimately systems that can transform. Need to plan for uncertainty and not just stability. And that really requires doing all of those things in the fourth bullet point, investing in short-term buffers like insurance and disaster response, but at the same time, investing in the capacities that can allow us to adapt and ultimately transform. And that requires thinking across these three central pillars of capitals: social, financial and capital, and natural, and find ways of how we can value these things in an equal manner. And how about you, Sibel?
Well, I would start to coming back actually to your first point. I think it's really important, this message that resilience investment, it's not optional. It's really a necessity, but also an opportunity. And I think it's important to pass that message. And then if I would just recommend three very practical things for decision makers, it's about we are in a time of crisis, right? We're seeing this much more frequent, much more intense, for instance, extreme climate events. So strengthening emergency response is crucial. And we can learn with the past. We have been doing this, and we can learn with what works and what doesn't work. Strengthening that is crucial, the capacity to cope when shocks hit. At the same time, we need to simultaneously foster diversity and innovation constantly. So that brings the new sources that will allow us to think differently, to do things differently, to adapt, and ultimately to transform away from trajectories that will just take us to bad places for nature and people, basically. Finally, I just wanted to really stress that, resilience is really not about the perfect solution, one-sided views or perspectives, or a technical fix that will just do it, and we'll say, we're resilient now. It's not about that. It's so much more than that. It's about relationships. It's about agency. It's about actively investing in this, in people and nature. And last but not least, really, so we're thrilled to have achieved this milestone of launching the report. It has been a fantastic journey, a learning journey together with all the people that contributed to this. I also really want to stress that this is the product of a fantastic team effort and collaboration. There's a lot of people that are not here that have been contributing to this and working with this on a daily basis. Our colleagues from the Global Resilience Partnership, the Stockholm Resilience Centre, Future Earth, that have been actively contributing to this. But it's a crucial milestone, but definitely not the end. So it's this also marks the beginning of the next phase of this process. So we don't want Resilience Science Must Knows to be a report you have on your shelf. We wanted to bring it out to the world and what does it mean to actually think like this and implement it in practice, in policy. So we are now in the process of together with close partners, starting to design the process that we will start in 2026. And we have first two key tracks that we are going to test. One would be to work closely with funders of resilience initiatives, because we see that the Resilience Science Must Knows are at a systemic level that is very useful for planning and designing, the enabling of ecosystems for resilience, let's call it like that. And the second track is working with partners that are working closely with the design and implementation of the national adaptation plans, together with countries, in also discussing ways of bringing the Resilience Science Must Knows into that design. And yeah, I think that's a wrap. And now I can just introduce Wendy again. So Wendy Broadgate, she's Global Hub Director of Future Earth in Sweden, and she will say some final remarks before the Q&As.
Thank you, Sibel. Thank you, Albert. This is a really, really exciting day. This baby has been a long time in the making, and it's been a super, super collaborative effort. So thank you for sharing the results of those labors with us. Super exciting. As we said at the beginning, we're going through really turbulent times. We're not at all on track to meet the Paris Agreement. We're heading for overshoot. In fact, thank you. In fact, unfortunately, current policies mean we're heading for 2.8 degrees. Thank you. That's better. Right, thanks. This is the decade of delivery. What we do in the next 5 years really, really counts. So I'm going to steal Ricardo's message from the beginning. The three organizations behind this report really truly believe in science-based action, and I think this really is an operating manual for survival on planet Earth. And I think it's been created in a way that is useful for policymakers. We want to have a dialogue with you. We want to continue the dialogue with how can we use the science in effective ways. So finally, I'd just like to say that investing in resilience is an essential part of climate action. So please take the guide, please use it. But I'd like now to open the floor for a few minutes of Q&A. I'd like to invite Albert, Sibel, Ricardo, Fatima to the floor. And if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. Any questions or comments? Yes, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Saliha Dabardzak. I'm with the Adaptation Fund. Really loved the show, I want to say. I love the event. And you may have noticed my colleague and I were snapping pictures of the myths, but also the must-knows. In the light of the must-knows, which were quite compelling and very much in line, I think, with our philosophy at the Adaptation Fund, do you have any reflections on this current global goals on adaptation discussion? And do you see areas where resilience must-knows could be, or the global goals on adaptation could be strengthened based on resilience must-knows?
No, that's a really good question. I can just begin by very honestly saying that I haven't in detail been following the process on the global goal of adaptation. I know that this COP, the indicators will be coming up on the table. That's going to be one of the discussions. I would imagine and I would be hoping there's a high level of congruence and overlap between what the resilience science must-knows are saying and the different categories of indicators and works and goals that the global goal of adaptation is setting up. I think we're hoping that that's the case. I would also welcome a dialogue between the different entities working in the adaptation field, the resilience field, in order to come up with coherent frameworks that capture as many of these different dynamics as possible.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that from the panel? No? Any further questions? We have a question at the back here.
Hi, my name is Bart de Waal from Join for Water. I have a question on the time span, the typical time span of a resilience cycle. Is this, I guess it's not a matter of days or weeks or months, it's rather a matter of years and decades. So how does this align with policy cycles? So, and then how do you sell resilience measures with policy intentions, as the time spans may not be very well aligned?
Go ahead, Sibel. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I can just give some answer to that. So I think that there are like different time scales within resilience. So like you can talk about resilience, as like sort of immediate response actually to shocks. That's one time scale. It's like you can build resilience here and now, or you can be ready for it, right? But then there's this also sort of like building resilience to this more like long-term or creeping changes, right? That we see, and a good example is a lot of sort of the things that are happening with climate change, right? Which impacts are not like immediately visible, right? And then that's what you need to build over time, through this sort of like capacity, like fostering this capacity for innovation, for fostering diversity, so fostering the capacity to adjust, to adapt over time, to transform. And you need sort of some kind of like anticipatory like thinking for that. Now, I think that this doesn't, unfortunately, and that's why we see the results, of what we're seeing now, right? Like, unfortunately, no, it does not align perfectly with like policies, political cycles, or with sort of like the policy speed, let's say like that. But we need to keep sort of like bringing the message. Like, if we bring the message that sort of like bringing, that building resilience is not optional, then we can actually also like open more the discussion of how do we do it, and that needs to be sort of like independent of sort of like political cycles. This is always difficult, but there are things like that. There are things that we actually don't compromise with despite political cycles, because they are considered to be essential. So the message is, that resilience is essential, and so it needs to be sort of in a way above that.
Yeah, if I may add to this, thank you for this really important question and for bringing up the point about timescales. Because I think we're actually facing a severe clash of timescales. On the one hand side, we have our policy cycles. We also have, decisions taken, let's say, in the financial market, even on much shorter timescales than that. And on the other hand, we have the response times of the Earth system, of the climate. So if we take it to the extreme, the ice sheets, for instance, they will continue to change for centuries, if not millennia, to the changes that we see in terms of emissions right now. So this really, I think, makes it very apparent that we're facing this clash of timescales. And the question with regard to resilience is, how do we deal with this? And I think a really important part of building resilience is to make sure that we consider these long-term, these committed impacts in the climate system and factor those into our decision-making right now. And that's a really tough thing to do, because we're not geared towards thinking about these longer timescales. But if the Earth system can teach us anything, it's that it is really our actions now that matter for the long-term future, for the next generations. And therefore, it's incredibly important to consider these timescales and to expand our time horizons when it comes to climate change and resilience.
Is this working? Okay. No, I just wanted to add a comment to the lady who asked a question about the global stocktake. I mean, I would say that all these 9 points, to me, offer some kind of a scaffolding for how you can do adaptation better. Because every one of these 9 points are essential to effective adaptation. And the reason why we have a stocktake is because for a very long time, we were struggling with how do you measure adaptation. Because we didn't have a sound enough metric system, comparatively speaking, in terms of mitigation. Mitigation was very clear-cut, quite easy. But adaptation often was, how do you measure something that hasn't happened yet? So that anticipatory aspect that Sibel was talking about often poses a problem, a challenge in terms of how you can effectively measure adaptation. So I would say, if this means that we can do adaptation better, we're not going to be siloed in terms of how we can, put in place effective principles of adaptation, the diversity element, the learning element, the innovative element, recognizing the power dynamics aspect, the experimentation. These are all essential ingredients of adaptation. So I think it makes the stocktake sharper, because it gives us the tools that we can use to better manage, to better adapt, and to better value. So I would say this, I think, should be an essential read for the global stocktake process and for those who are involved in it. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I know there are more questions. We've unfortunately run out of time, but I have some good news for you. We have a reception, and I'd like to invite you all to engage with the speakers and the authors during that reception. So I'd like to end with a few thank yous. Thank you to all our speakers today. Thank you to Albert and Sibel for your leadership of this report, to all of our editorial board members, to all of the stakeholders that have engaged in dialogues along the way, and last but not least, to the teams behind the scenes of Global Resilience Partner, Future Earth, and Stockholm Resilience Centre, who've worked to make this event possible. So please join us for a few drinks and engage, and you can take copies of the report.